Okay, to start learning this piece, we're going to eventually get 1 through 4, measures 1 through 4 learned here. However, these earlier videos are going to be a little bit more front-loaded because we need to talk about all the rhythm stuff. Once we've gotten really comfortable with the rhythms, you'll see groupings start to recur throughout this, so we won't have to break things down quite as much anymore. You'll be like, oh, I've seen that rhythm before, and you'll just be able to apply it with the new notes. At the beginning, though, this might take a little bit of time, so bear with me, be patient, and get ready to talk about rhythms. So let's look first just at the 2 beginning measures, okay? Now, you see the double dotted quarter. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. And then we've got a 16th note. We have a real counting for a 16th note, right? We're used to that. Okay, no big deal. Then we have a dotted 8th, fine, and 2 32nd notes. Okay, we don't have true counting for 32nds, but we have a counting for 16ths, so dividing that out is not too bad. We could do this while staying in 3. However, I think long term, your rhythm will be more accurate if we drop into an 8th note pulse, and I think your subdivisions will be easier to maintain too, because you'll have a greater feeling of motion and movement, keeping your rhythm on track and keeping your tempo steady than you will at a slower quarter note pulse. What that means is instead of saying your quarter note equals 1 now, we are going to say your 8th note equals 1. It's metric manipulation. We are just changing your pulse. Okay, that's all we're doing. You know how when we zoom out in the other pieces and we think in 1 or in 2 instead of in 3 or 4 respectively, this time we're going the opposite direction. Instead of making that bigger, we are going to go smaller and make our pulse part of a beat and say that now is a beat. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying our 8th note is now a beat. An 8th note gets 1. So there are 3 quarter notes in a measure, so there are 6 8th notes. So we are thinking in 6 here, okay? All our measures must add up to 6. With that in mind, 1 8th note, the rhythmic relations are like the relationships between rhythms is still, that's static, that's not going to change. Okay, so 2 8th notes still fit inside a quarter note here, okay? That's not different. 2 16th notes fit inside a single 8th note, okay? That is still stable. So with that in mind, think about that quarter note at the beginning. You've got a double dotted quarter note. Okay, let's take just the quarter note by itself. How many beats is that quarter note? Well, we were saying an 8th note is now 1 beat. 2 8th notes fit inside a quarter, so a quarter with no dots would get 2 beats, okay? Humor me for now and just write in above your music, write 1 2 above that quarter, okay? That is the quarter note itself, gets 2 beats now because we're in an 8th note pulse. Now, a dot adds half the value of the beat to the beat, half the value of the note, half the value of the note to the note. Okay, so that first dot is adding half of a quarter note, which would be an 8th note. So we're adding an 8th note to this. Well, an 8th note is 1 in this, so that would be beat 3. So the quarter note is 1 2, the first dot is 3. Then the last dot adds half the value of the previous dot to the note. So the first dot added a full beat, so this dot adds half a beat. So it's the first half of beat 4. So write 4 there, okay? Now let's look at that 16th note. A 16th note is half of an 8th note. That is the last half of beat 4. Anything that we divide into halves, that we're dividing into 2 even parts, we count with ands on the halves, right? So that is the and of 4. So when you play this, it's going to be 1 2 3 and 4 and 5. That's the counting there. And did you hear me do something we call prepping the subdivision? When you're starting, you can think 1 2, but you want to make sure that you're moving to that and on time. Well, you don't want to necessarily think 1 2 3 4 and, because your and might be delayed then, or might be too early. If you don't prep the subdivision, if you don't have that subdivision running earlier in your mind, you may end up late or early on the and itself. So what I want you to think is 1 2, at least by 3. At least by 3 have your subdivision running. But I would prefer it, I think it's safer, to think 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Okay? You could think 1 2 3 and 4 and 5. That would be the minimum amount of prep work that I want you to do for prepping that subdivision. But the point is, you want that prep there. You don't want to start subdividing when you have to play at that subdivision level. You need to be thinking it prior. Prep your subdivisions. Okay, so that's that first little tiny chunk, right? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Making sense? Awesome. Now let's look at that dotted eighth with the 2 16th notes. Sorry, 32nd notes, the 2 32nd notes. So we have that trill on a dotted eighth note. So the dotted eighth note by itself, we've said, is a beat, right? That is our beat. That's a pulse. That's 1. That equals 1. So in this case, that's beat 5, right? All of beat 5 is that eighth note. Awesome. Now the dot. A dot adds half the value of the note to the note. Half of a quarter note, half of an eighth note is a 16th note. And again, halves, having things, right? We count as 6 and, or 5 and, or 4 and, whatever. It's the number and, right? That's how we have something. If something's divided into equal groups of 2, then we count it as the number and an and. So that dotted eighth note, you should be thinking 5 and 6. In the dotted eighth note itself, the and falls on the first 32nd note, which is the C there. And of course, the last part of that, the last note that you have, that B natural at the end, is the okay? Because we're taking that and, okay? And we're now dividing that out into, it would be like if we were dividing something into a group of 4, right? So you could think 5E and a 6E and or just 5 and 6 and okay? But that is your next division there. So even though that's normally how we would count 16th notes, because we're diving one further, we're going into an eighth note pulse, that is how you would count 32nd notes, because a 32nd note would be 4 32nd notes go into one eighth note. So we're dividing that eighth note into a group of 4. We count even groups of 4 as the number E and a. Okay, hopefully that's making sense. So I'm going to count with the metronome that first measure, prepping your subdivision, and then I'm going to play it so you know what I'm talking about. Ready, go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and a 1. Okay, same thing, playing. Count the subdivisions while I play. Ready, and. Okay, I didn't put the trill in there because we're not going to mess with it just yet. All right, hopefully that is making sense. We are in an eighth note pulse, so eighth notes are a full beat now, which means 16th notes are half of a beat, 32nd notes are a quarter of a beat, and so on. That also means quarter notes are now 2 beats. Okay, this is the most critical thing that we could talk about in this entire piece. Could you count this in 3? Yes. Are you going to be as accurate? Highly unlikely. You are much better off, in my opinion, zooming in to the eighth note pulse and being rock solid on your articulation, or on your notes and rhythms and articulations. But you want to zoom in so that your rhythms are accurate. Okay, so that is measure 1. Now let's apply this to measure 2. Okay, it's the same thing that we just left in measure 1. The final 2 beats of measure 1 are the first 2 beats of measure 2. They're rhythmically identical. Okay, so that of course is going to be 1 and 2, because we need to keep the subdivision running in our mind. We have to have that continuing, or we are going to be late or early. If you don't have your subdivisions running, there's a high likelihood of you being early or late on notes. So just make sure you've got the subdivision running. So we're going to think on that E natural, we'll think 1 and 2. Then on our 32nd notes, it's and a. Okay, 1 and 2 and a. And then our F sharp there, that dotted quarter is of course 3 full beats. So that's 3, 4, and 5 all together. Okay, which leaves an eighth note at the end, and well, of course, that would be 6, because we have 6 eighth notes in our measure. So now we're going to learn to actually count this, and we're going to count this in a couple ways. First, we're going to go back to probably what feels like middle school band. We're going to clap our rhythm, but the reason for that is I want you to verbalize your subdivisions, because this is what should be running in your head, and clap the rhythms, which should be articulated on your flute. Okay? It will sound like this. Ready, and go. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and a 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 1. Okay. That's what I want you to do. Do this with me a couple times because I want you to get really, really comfortable with an eighth note pulse and that subdivision running in your head, which is technically a 16th note subdivision. Of course, when you work with a metronome, depending on how your metronome works, you're probably going to just set your quarter to, like right now we're at 60. My metronome says quarter equals 60 at the moment, and I have an eighth note clicking. You just have to remember that quarter note, all that really means is your pulse. It's a quarter note because it's the most common thing, but it's just what equals 1. Okay, so in this case, our quarter note, whatever our beat is, equals 60. Our beat is technically the eighth note. Okay, so even though my metronome says the eighth note is clicking, truly it's a 16th note clicking. What that is really telling you is we're getting half of the beat as a subdivision. Okay, so we're getting 1 and 2 and 3 and all the way through 6 and right clicking at us. That is what's happening. So even if your metronome, if you're like, but my metronome won't do that, set your quarter note to 60 and know in your heart that it's not a quarter note, it's your eighth note, that's your pulse. All right, we're gonna do this a couple times. Verbalize the subdivisions, clap the rhythms. Ready, go. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and a 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and 5 and, okay. And actually, we're going to, if you want to just say 3, 4, 5, for now, we're actually going to end up prepping a different subdivision in there anyway. Okay, let's do it one more time. Ready, and go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and a 1 and 2 and a 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. Okay? And that 6 you can whisper if you want because it's a rest, or you can just say it, whatever. But remember, nothing will be happening there. It's a rest. You'll be breathing. That's what you'll be doing there. Mark that breath note now. Breath note. Breath mark. Mark the breath mark in that rest. You will need it.